My name's Justin McClure, and I'm here today with
Will Sloan.
And you're listening to the Important Cinema Club. And today, we're going to take a little tour of the disturbed mind, because we're talking about the filmography of Charlie Kaufman.
And that's right, we're going to start at the end. Do we give these movies thumbs up or thumbs down? That's traditionally how we end the podcast, right? Well, and now we're in the middle.
Oh, no, you're not supposed to start with the middle unless you want to create a suspenseful thing that we're going to get back to later and recontextualize.
You know, Justin, I really loved Charlie Kaufman when I was a teenager. I saw Adaptation when I was 14, I think. Totally blew my mind. Loved him, wanted to be him, wanted to think like this man. I haven't spent a lot of time with Charlie Kaufman in the last 10 years, and if there's ever anything that I really liked as a teen, I'm inclined to be skeptical. I still think he's good, it turns out.
Well, I wrote a little paragraph here of my thoughts on Charlie Kaufman, and I will read them verbatim. All of his work is a reflection of the frustrations we have when we become aware of life and the powerlessness of humans and the futility of living, which is a feeling that may last forever, but is particularly powerful when you become a teenager, which is why teenagers always latch on to Charlie Kaufman's work, because we were teenagers when we saw it, and for the first time we were seeing a filmmaker that was going, hey, you know, life is weird, it's also miserable, and you have no control over it.
And you know what's amazing? Watching these movies again this week, I feel even more so that way. Now I'm older. I'm a senior citizen of 31 years old, and these issues seem all the more pressing to me now.
You know, I think a good way to approach this is to talk about what people hate about Charlie Kaufman and deconstruct why we may like it. For example, very full of himself, pretentious even.
Narcissistic, navel-gazing.
And all the movies are all about that, which doesn't it make it worse that he acknowledges that he's narcissistic and then presents it to the viewer?
A guy who just can't get out of his own head, a screenwriter who's constantly relying on show-offy gimmicks.
I mean, I remember when I saw Being John Malkovich, and like every teenager that saw it went, what is this? This is the greatest movie ever! And it's so difficult to try to like explain to anyone who is younger than us, like, oh yeah, everybody liked this movie. And they're like, what? They did? It's true.
Well, I watched it again this week, and I liked it better than ever. I don't know if you feel that way, Justin, but I think he's really good. He's the one screenwriter that I think a lot of people can name because, you know, not just because he wrote himself as a character into one of his movies, although that's a big part of it, but also because, like any auteur, he has a set of recurring themes and motifs. He's written 2 movies, at least, where two characters are running through a character's subconscious and they pass awkward, buried memories.
I think that Charlie Kaufman is also defined by the pathetic loser men that are in his movies. Not just himself, like in Adaptation, but watching Being John Malkovich this time really made me remember, oh yeah, John Cusack is the full-out villain of this movie, which is great because you associate John Cusack with the charming, say-anything leading man, but this film goes out of its way to portray this, like, struggling puppeteer artist as just the biggest loser. And just in case you don't get it, look at his hair. It's terrible.
Revisiting these movies, I think I was worried that they were gonna seem too gimmicky. Something that I appreciated this time around is I think these movies are both very truthful and very funny and very uncompromising about the sadness of life. People sometimes say that he's a downer, but I mean, most movies that you see, most commercial movies are essentially upbeat and happy. I read a line from the critic A.S. Hamra a couple weeks ago talking about Taste of Cherry. He said that it uses cinema to figure out if life is worth living, a hard question that seems superficial because so many films easily reach the conclusion that it is. And I thought about that watching these Charlie Kaufman movies, which are so much about how time doesn't necessarily make things better, how you don't necessarily become a better person as you get older and regrets accumulate.
The structures of cinema as a narrative form are perceived to be successful by the viewer in its most conventional aspect when it's a character succeeds and reaches over a problem that they had to move on with their lives and have things be better. That is almost never the case in a Charlie Kaufman movie. Things are only miserable by the end. Maybe the film has revealed something, but it could be, for example, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. It's just that these people, because of the mechanism that they're using to deal with their pain, are caught in an endless Mobius strip.
Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, I think, you know, if Charlie Kaufman has genius, the end of that movie hits on it, which is, it is a piercingly accurate depiction of the dissolution of a relationship, but it suggests that even failed relationships are worth having because that's all we have, you know?
And by removing that, like, who are you? You're just going to go through the same steps you went before because you need those building blocks to keep going in some form, whether it be a worse one than what had come before.
And in his movies, he's constantly obsessed with the idea of human connection, how precious it is, how rare it is, and how fickle it is when you get it.
I think that one thing that, from a distance, after you haven't seen his films in a long time, that you forget, is that he's, like, really funny. Like, he started writing for sitcoms and sketch comedy shows like the Dana Carvey Show, and he wrote on Chris Elliott's Get a Life, that, like, super weird satirical sitcom, which is great. And that kind of DNA is transferred into his movies, that even Being John Malkovich, you know, when you think about it, you usually think about the finale and the tragic nature of what happens to the John Cusack character, when in reality there are so many essentially Simpsons gags, like, on the way to get there. Like, at one point they're watching a video about why the floor is...
It's the 7.5 floor of this office building.
And why the ceilings are so short. And, like, there's a recreation of, like, the guy who owns the floor talking to a little person, and he's like, I will create a place where your accursed kind can find joy. That is a Simpson line if there ever was one.
You know, sometimes when we do this podcast, I wonder how formal we need to be, and I wonder if, like, I start thinking about podcast theory, and I wonder, do people want to, like, just for the sake of structure, hear what the plot of the movie is? So Being John Malkovich is about people who find a portal into the head of John Malkovich, which everybody knows.
Couldn't it just be called Being Tom Cruise, as Robert Shea, the executive of New Line, said after he turned the project down?
It is really funny. Like, John Malkovich is the exact perfect choice for this movie.
Such the perfect choice. I mean, there's so many scenes in the movie where somebody's like, you know, John Malkovich, he was in that movie.
And I realized watching it, it's like, what is his Raging Bull? What is the movie that you associate John Malkovich with?
Well, there's a scene where the guy's like, oh, I love that movie where you went full R. That was great. Yes. And I thought about it. I was like, oh, it's Of Mice and Men. That's the movie he's talking about.
But yeah, it is a really funny movie. And, you know, I watched 20 minutes of Human Nature today, and I decided not to finish it because it was just as bad as I remembered. But, like, his screenplays, I guess, do call for a very particular kind of tone. Like, Being John Malkovich, the whole thing is treated so deadpan and even literally. It's funny how it depicts the most surreal ideas, like the 7.5 floor or John Malkovich's puppetry career that dominates the last act of the movie. It depicts these things as just totally normal, as if they're unfolding in the real world. When they go into John Malkovich's brain, and when there's a chase scene through Malkovich's brain, it depicts the brain as this almost literal space, as if it has a geography that you can travel through, and these memories are unfolding as if they're scenes in a movie. I mean, that's very funny.
Well, Spike Jonze is the perfect director for Charlie Kaufman because he has a way of making the most surreal situation just feel normal. Just the way that he shoots it, just the way that he, like, tunes the performances of all his cast members. Like, as weird as this is, it doesn't feel out of the ordinary or slap you in the face. Like, I watched Confessions of a Dangerous Mind, George Clooney's film that Charlie Kaufman adapted the Chuck Barris book from, and that's a movie that just doesn't work. Like, Clooney cannot get on the same wavelengths of Charlie Kaufman's script. He tries to paper it over with, like, crazy visual stuff, but it's just so, like, leaden, and it just sits there. That's a movie that just doesn't work for me.
For people who don't know this movie, and it's possible they don't, this was based on the autobiography of the host of The Gong Show, which was a short-lived, rather trashy TV show, like game show type thing in the 1970s. And Chuck Barris, I guess, in a cry for attention, wrote this autobiography where he claimed that the whole time he was an assassin for the CIA. And I know that George Clooney and everybody else has given interviews where they say, oh, this Charlie Kaufman script, like, this was one of the best scripts ever. This script was getting passed around time. You wouldn't believe it. But apparently Clooney made some very drastic alterations to the script. Kaufman has all but disowned it. And I think there's a quote from Clooney where he says something like, look, there was some far out stuff in there that you just couldn't get in a studio movie at that time.
You could have done it, George. You could have done it.
Well, I mean, you look at the other Charlie Kaufman movies and it's like, why turn it into a Milos Forman movie if you have a Charlie Kaufman script?
Charlie Kaufman's entire career is one that I think is defined by failure. If you look at like articles about him, it's like he has these 7 things that are about to come out, and the studio is always like, I don't know, this is a little bit crazy and I don't want to touch it. Like, even after he made Synecdoche, New York, which, you know, didn't do very well financially, but was pretty well critically received, he could not get anything off the ground after that.
I mean, I think Synecdoche, New York, like, lost $20 million. There was a period there in the early 2000s when I guess Kaufman was kind of hot, and adaptation from 2002 would have been a pretty high-profile project for him to get, because as anyone who has seen it knows, this was Kaufman adapting the runaway bestseller by Susan Orlean, The Orchid Thief, and he turned it into a screenplay about his own struggles to adapt the screenplay. Do you like this one?
Oh, yeah, I think it's great. Featuring the last good Nicolas Cage performance.
Oh, that's not true. He's done good stuff since then. But it's a kind of Nicolas Cage performance that you don't see that much anymore.
Mm-hmm. It's one that I think is focused and is not showy in an attempt to break acting and bring it to another level, and worked within the context of the story that's being told.
Can I tell you the, I guess, demurral or the question I had about this movie when I watched it this week? This has been haunting me a little bit. So I like this movie very much, but the plot of it is all about how, you know, Charlie Kaufman, he can't adapt The Orchid Thief because it doesn't lend itself to a screenplay. It doesn't have a clean 3-act structure. Early in the movie, he says something like, why can't a movie just be about flowers? Charlie Kaufman writes a fictional twin brother character for himself, Donald Kaufman, who is kind of depicted as his alternate self. He's a hack Hollywood screenwriter, and he's very happy and he's very successful, and he's written a very hacky, stupid script that's getting a lot of buzz. You know, famously, adaptation is credited to both Charlie and Donald Kaufman because the last third of the movie is Donald's work. This adaptation of The Orchid Thief actually becomes a shitty Hollywood action movie where, you know, there are chases and somebody gets eaten by a crocodile and everything. And it's very clever. It's very brilliant. Doesn't it seem a little bit defeatist to you? Like, isn't Kaufman saying that, like, you can't adapt The Orchid Thief?
Well, the argument is within the Hollywood system. That's where he's working, right? Because you can have experimental cinema that is moving and is different. You're not going to open that, like, wide on 1 million screens because, let's be honest, people want blockbuster entertainment.
Or they want slick Oscar stuff. Like, there's a part in adaptation where he's talking to the studio executive played by Tilda Swinton, and she says something like, well, we were thinking that maybe LaRoche and Susan Orlean could fall in love. Corny stuff like that. I watched the movie and I felt myself just a little bit like, well, I would actually like to see an adaptation of The Orchid Thief that's good, you know?
But then he turns around and he makes Synecdoche, New York, and it fails miserably, and it's like, oh yeah, see, look, he's right. You can't do this.
Well, let's talk about Synecdoche, New York, which is his real big swing for the fences. This, I think, he made when he was like, it was after Eternal Sunshine. He's maximum peak hot, you know? And he
can do whatever he wants. And I mean, isn't that what the movie's about?
Yeah, it is. Like all of his movies, there is a Charlie Kaufman surrogate character who's a brilliant, although we don't see a lot of evidence of his brilliance, but we are to infer brilliant theater director played by Philip Seymour Hoffman, whose latest production is an adaptation of Death of a Salesman where the leads are played by young people. So that seems like a bad idea, but...
Isn't the argument, though, is that, like, none of his characters are really brilliant?
Yeah.
They are often told by other people that they're brilliant, but we never see that brilliance. We only see their self-loathing, which is much more fun, because any movie where a character goes, and that's the end of my story, and my book gets published, you're like, what? That's not good. So that's the only way to go about it.
But Philip Seymour Hoffman gets a MacArthur Genius Grant. He can basically write his own ticket, create anything he wants, and so he wants to create a play that actually deals with life, actually summarizes life and shows it as it is. And over the course of the movie, which is very strange and surreal, it becomes this massive, it takes place essentially in a warehouse that becomes an entire city unto itself. A playtime, if you will, full of apartment buildings with actors playing versions of themselves and versions of other people. He hires somebody to play a version of himself, and then hires somebody to play a version of that actor, constantly striving and failing to create the world or replicate the world while his own actual world is withering and decaying all around him.
I mean, you want to take a step back and go, but your world is boring and you're miserable. Why would you want to recreate that and force it onto people, even with all the context surrounding
That's
it?
That's a good question. Although I actually do think it is maybe an honorable pursuit, just because, like, I found some of these movies this week, including the new one that he just had. I'm thinking of ending things. I found some of these movies kind of therapeutic, like just in how bleak they are. I sort of like these movies that they attempt to tell it like it is.
So were they therapeutic in the sense that you looked at them and you went, whew, I'm not that bad off?
Well, first of all, I'm not that bad off, but I'll tell you, like, I'm an old man now, and I've seen the aging process all around me. I've seen people that I've known since I was the age of 0, age 31 years, and they don't get better. And, like, aging is not, I mean, maybe it's good in some ways, but in a lot of ways it's not good. And I like that these movies, like, you don't often see that that basic human reality reflected in movies.
I have a little movie called On Golden Pond about the horrors of aging, for you will. And in Synecdoche, New York, it's all about, Philip Seymour Hoffman, time just flowing away from him in many funny ways. Charlie Kaufman, for people who haven't seen the movie, he constructs the film as that, like, within one scene, there's, like, multiple date signifiers, just to let you know that, like, months are going by, even though it seems like it's just one moment that's happening linearly. And,
I found Synecdoche, New York this time around, like, pretty devastating, like pretty emotionally difficult. But
I found it so funny.
But that's the thing. It is so funny. Like that scene where he's reunited with his daughter on her deathbed.
Yes. There's an amazing joke where Philip Seymour Hoffman reads an article that his daughter has gotten a full body tattoo, and he completely starts freaking out, and he starts yelling at Michelle Williams, "Oh my God, my daughter got a full body tattoo!" And Michelle Williams is like, "Oh, what are you talking about? Everybody has one." And she lifts up her shirt to show a giant tiger. And it cuts to Philip Seymour Hoffman being like, I don't remember that, but okay.
Yes.
Kaufman is all about Kafka-esque, like, the world around you doesn't make sense, but it feels like everybody else thinks it makes sense. But, the person at the center is like, I'm lost. But I think that what makes it good is that the person at the center, the Charlie Kaufman surrogate, is also a piece of shit. Like, he's not like an innocent in all of this going, oh, woe is me, the world is terrible. His inability to act, or acting selfish, is what leads to the kind of tragic finales that you get in all of his scripts and movies.
And, I hadn't really thought about that, but you're right. Like, so many of his characters are creative people who aspire to the level of genius, but we see not only no evidence of it, but the work they produce is, like, laughable. Like the John Cusack character in Being John Malkovich with his pretentious puppetry.
I mean, that puppetry, very good, but oh man, is it pretentious. I think a good movie to discuss, though, is the new one that just came out, the Netflix film, I'm Thinking of Ending Things, because it is a perfect distillation of everything Charlie Kaufman has tackled up to this point, but approaching it again from almost a critical angle. So we're going to spoil the movie, I think, because if we're going to talk about it. So if you haven't seen it, I don't know, skip like 5 minutes and then, get back to us when we're like, letters. So what I loved about this movie is that you watch a trailer, you're like, oh, it's weird. Is it like a time travel thing or, something odd involving reality changing? I mean, about an hour in, I'm like, oh, okay, this is an identity situation. This is a story being written, and these characters are in this story that continually changes. And what I loved about it is, this is based on a novel that, from reviews I've read, is very straightforward. It basically ends with a twist like, oh my god, these characters are real! Shocker! While instead, in Charlie Kaufman adaptation, it's about the fictional character realizing that she can move beyond this lame author, that she does not need to be defined by the things that he likes, and almost trying to escape the kind of closed reality that a loser man who can only kind of regurgitate his influences into a narrative.
I mean, there's a lot in there about how ideas and influences shape our reality and even create the reality that we live in. And I like that the particular cultural reference points that the movie uses, like so the plot, such as it is about a woman and her newish boyfriend, and they go to his parents' home in the country, and like there's a part where you see his childhood bedroom, and like on his bookshelf it's like David Foster Wallace, Pauline Kael, a lot of stuff in there that's very kind of like, the kind of stuff that I would have been like really into when I was discovering Charlie Kaufman movies.
Yeah, that's right. There's a moment where one of the characters just turns into Pauline Kael and rants about John Cassavetes. Chef's kiss.
Yeah. I mean, this movie, which I found like, I also found this movie like very devastating for reasons that I'm not really sure I can articulate, because it's so dense and it's quite difficult, and I'm not quite sure how to talk about it in a way that's like not incredibly shallow and stupid, except to say that I was very moved by like the ways that these characters interact with these pseudo characters interact with each other. Nobody is quite connecting. Nobody like everybody's conversation is just a little bit off. They're laughing at the wrong parts. They're pausing, and the parents like. Time is constantly sandpapering away all of their good qualities.
The movie is so funny too. Like the reactions, that they're so real while being almost too piercing in the reality, and the way that the movie constantly rewrites itself as well to like, the person writing the story is trying to find other more positive ways to go, but it's almost like his uncomfortable reality is kind of imposing itself on the film until it only has one last place to go, which is pure fatalism. And I think that what I really enjoyed is that because this was a movie adaptation, he let the actual language of film infect by the end, even if it's in the most cliche ways where, oh, you know what? It's turning into a musical. There's animated segments, and it ends with a recreation of the speech from A Beautiful Mind.
Which is so funny. So funny.
That is so funny, yeah. And I can understand people thinking that, like, it is pretentious that he never comes out and says what's going on. Like, you could be confused being like, I don't know what's going on, if you're not trying to find that twist in your mind. The book, like, comes out and says, oh, this was all a fabrication. There's, like, an epilogue where two characters are talking about what happened.
But even so, I think the movie, like, works very strongly just on, like, almost as music. Like, it works very strongly on an emotional level.
And by the end, when it is essentially a big joke, only to land in, like, a place where it doesn't come out and say, like, oh, these characters are dead now. But that's what it's saying, that there's only so far you can take a life built out of references to other things.
I'm interested in Kaufman's future, because I know that in interviews he said that many of his movies have lost money. Anomalisa lost money. He's always said that he approaches every movie as if it may be the last, which is hard to think, but, who knows?
I'm curious if he could be a being that exists only in the streaming models that, like, Amazon and Netflix bat him between each other. Make a movie there, make a movie here. I'm thinking of Ending Things. Does not seem like an expensive movie to me. It mostly takes place in a car and a house.
And, it seems to be a movie that has sparked a certain amount of discourse too. Like people are talking about this movie in the sort of way that they would have talked about like last year at Marion Bad in the 60s.
And he is still trying to do that big budget Hollywood thing. I mean, the film that he wrote like the first draft of, he's still credited on it, Doug Liman's Chaos Walking, has been sitting on a shelf for like 5 years. When the studio puts it out, who knows? But it's nice that he can still get in there and write some scripts for big projects, while hopefully he can just go off to the side and do his own little things. As long as, I guess, they're not Synecdoche, New York size.
Wasn't he a ghostwriter on Kung Fu Panda, like one of the sequels to that?
Are you thinking of Noah Baumbach?
Noah Baumbach was a ghostwriter on Madagascar.
Oh, he was not a ghostwriter. He's credited on Madagascar 3.
Oh,
and
wow.
I think he did a draft, and he was supposed to direct Mr. Popper's Penguins as well.
Well, divorce is expensive, isn't it?
Exactly. So, you're right. I'm excited to see where Charlie Kaufman goes. I mean, he's a novelist now, and the novel is all about a pathetic film critic who thinks he's great, but is really a giant loser.
Wouldn't know anything about that. So, Justin, do we have any letters this week?
We do have letters. As per usual, you can send us letters at importantcinemaclubpodcast@gmail.com. And our first one is from Luke Maxwell, and he goes, "Hey, Justin and Will. Long time, first time. Love the show. You two have got me through many a dull commute. Many episodes ago, you were talking about Kevin Smith's recent career. Were we?"
I feel like we're always, perpetually, he's never far from our minds, is he?
I feel like Kevin Smith for me and you is a very off-mic thing, where it's like, what's Kevin Smith up to these days? The thing that always comes to mind with Smith is his stint as a guest star in Degrassi, where he played himself and broke up Caitlin and Joey days before their wedding. I'm a fan of Degrassi and had stopped watching the show when this plotline happened. Still, it sticks with me. Smith says he's a big fan of the show, but not enough to get out of the way of a big romance plotline 3 series in the making. People had been waiting on this wedding since the end of School's Out. I know this doesn't have much to do with Smith's cinema, but I think it shows a sort of Canadian-centric opportunism that paves the way for yoga hosers. Well, Smith's on Degrassi. Now, I remember this was a big deal, and I think I speak for the both of us when I say we did not watch Degrassi.
I haven't seen an entire episode of Degrassi. I realize I'm a bad Canadian for saying that. What I can say, though, is that this Kevin Smith episode was sold as a standalone DVD, and I saw it at Rogers Video a lot.
Oh my god, it haunted bargain bins for years.
And it had the title Jay and Silent Bob Go to Degrassi or something like that. You remember that?
I remember. I think I watched maybe the first episode he was on, and I was like, I can't make heads and tails of this. I had to have been watching the regular series, and I'm not going to start doing that, so no thank you.
I think it does speak to something in the Canadian national character, though. We love being acknowledged by Americans.
Oh my god, we are so pathetic when it comes to that. Do you remember how it felt like
The Simpsons?
Yeah, The Simpsons.
Yeah, I knew you were going to say
Canada
it.
was obsessed with The Simpsons coming to Canada, which they only did for 10 minutes.
That Simpsons in Canada moment was an epochal moment in everybody's childhood up here. You just have to understand
I
that.
remember all of Canada was tuned into that episode wondering, wait, is this the Canadian one? Did they play a repeat of some kind? Kevin Smith's, me and Will were literally talking 2 days ago about we promised we'd never talk about this again, but how can we get back to this subject some way? And I feel like we've talked about every single one of his movies.
In some length, yes.
I don't think we ever had an episode on Yoga Hosers, which we did watch together.
I think I watched it with you, and I think I talked about Yoga Hosers on the dearly departed These Boys Are Good Boys podcast. So my thoughts about it are out there in the world somewhere.
But nobody should go looking at that. It's like the Ark of the Covenant. You want to open that podcast up because your face will melt. So thanks for sending us that letter, Luke. And again, you can send us letters at importantcinemaclubpodcast@gmail.com. So it's a new month, so that means it's a new Gold Ninja video release, and this month it's And God Said to Cain, a Klaus Kinski spaghetti western that also plays as kind of a gothic horror film. It's about Klaus Kinski getting out of jail and vowing revenge on the man who put them there, which involves him picking up a gun with unlimited bullets and going to a town in the middle of the night as a tornado hits, and Kinski basically killing everyone in that town. Directed by Antonio Margaretti, who did Cannibal Apocalypse and gets name-checked in Inglourious Bastards. I believe it's Brad Pitt says that his name is Antonio Margaretti in the final party sequence. So, big famous Italian director, great spaghetti western, perfect for the kind of scary season because it's like a gothic horror style western. And of course, because Gold Ninja video release, packed special features. commentary. There's a featurette that I did on horror westerns. Me and Will have a talk about Klaus Kinski and basically the films that he took to pay the bills. None of the Werner Herzog ones or anything like that. And as a bonus film, it's a spaghetti western with gothic undertones, The Moment to Kill, which is very underrated and very fun. So you can pick that up at goldninjavideo.com. And we're running low, but there's still some Ninja Vortex Blu-ray sets available. The 3-disc Godfrey Ho and Friends extravaganza that me and everybody I know put together. So if you haven't picked that up yet, do it now, or it will disappear and you will always regret it. So this week on our Patreon episode, we're talking Larry Cohen. Why? Because me and Will got the new Vinegar Syndrome release of Perfect Strangers, and we love Larry Cohen.
I could talk about Larry Cohen all day. We should do just a whole podcast series where we go through every one of his movies.
Oh yeah, movie by movie? And
then we go back and we do it again. And then we go back and do it again. Just
That's
forever.
Something that I feel like me and you, we never do, which is like, when I listen to like movie podcasts, I'll pick one movie, and they'll like dissect it scene by scene, which is like, oh man, feels so long. But I mean, if that's what the audiences want, I mean, we could do it in a Patreon form of some kind. Because speaking of Patreon, I'm doing, I guess, is it Pledge Drive? Is that what NPR does? Where it's like, and all those public access stations, the Max Fun Drive, where we're asking people, we want to hit 300 Patreon subscribers. That's nothing. If you listen to this show and you've been listening to it for a while, you should become a Patreon subscriber. And what will we do if you do become a Patreon subscriber? Well, there's a bunch of options that we put on the Patreon page, and you get to vote.
And what are the options?
The first one is Ernest Fest, and it's me and will watch all of the 5 final Ernest films in a row over one day, and we'll do a little podcast about each of them, which we will then edit together and put only for the 300 Patreon subscribers. It will then disappear from the internet. Actually, for all the choices, that's what we're going to do. We're going to record a podcast on them, and then put it on the internet for those 300 people, and then nothing else.
But what matters is we're talking about Ernest Goes to Africa, Ernest in the Army, Slam Dunk Ernest, Ernest Goes to School, one of the other ones.
I believe I've seen Ernest Goes to School. I don't think I've seen any of the other ones.
Whoa. Unbelievable.
And you know what? It sounds like people are voting, and that's not going to happen, because we also have a Shrek marathon.
Oh, no. Please vote for Ernest, please.
We were, where we watched 4 Shrek films, and then the 2 Shrek specials, Shrek the Halls and Scared Shrekless.
Yeah.
And finally, I put in like a wild card one, because I was like, oh, we can't just have 2. I mean, there was one that I suggested, and Will vetoed, rightfully so, but I will not speak of that again.
Oh, I'll tell them. It was going to be a Zack Snyder marathon.
Yeah. And Will was like, I can't do it. I'm like, when will I ever watch the Owls of Al Ghul or whatever it's called?
I would be happy to go to my grave without ever seeing the Owls of Gahul.
There you go. Will's a real fan. He knows the title. And finally, it's 5 video game movies in the 90s, which last time I checked is the one that's leading the polls.
That's fine, you know, Super Mario Brothers. I love that shit.
But I think you can still go back and switch it to Ernest, which is what we would prefer. So, you know. And what's great about Ernest is we will still suffer watching those movies.
Oh, yeah. But it's my kind of suffering, you know?
Yeah, but we will come back greater men afterwards. Just greater human beings. So, if you want to hear that episode, you got to become a Patreon subscriber. We have to hit 300 subscribers, patreon.com/theimportantcinemaclub. Okay, so what are we doing next week, Will?
We've done very little animation on this show. We did Tex Avery, I guess, maybe one other. But we're going into the world of not just animation, but claymation. We were talking about Nick Park, the multi-Academy Award-winning director of all of the Wallace and Gromit films, Chicken Run, and Creature Comforts.
So we're going to watch those, which were never a part of my childhood. But come on, it's claymation. It's great. I love it. So that's what we're going to be talking about next week. And until then, my name's Jonathan Glue.
I'm Will Sloan.
Thanks for listening. Hello, Justin here, interrupting briefly to thank some of our new Patreon subscribers, who include Taydrem, Quinn Dobbins, Y2K Podcast, Ben Borchard, and Samuel Smith. Thank you very much for becoming Patreon subscribers, and if you would like your name read on this podcast, make sure to subscribe before we hit 300, and you can do so by going to patreon.com/theimportantcinemaclub. And if you need more movie podcasts, I'm on 2 almost every week. There's the Bay Street Street Video Podcast, where me and Mark Hansen go through all the new Blu-rays and DVDs that are released every week, and also the No Such Thing as a Bad Movie podcast, where me, April Litmansky, and Colin Cunningham talk through an entire bad movie, I'm making air quotes here, and try to focus on the positive. You can find No Such Thing as a Bad Movie and the Bay Street Video Podcast wherever you get your podcast. And now we return you to your regular scheduled programming.
Justin and I hung out this week, we saw each other in person, which, ever since the start of the pandemic, I've basically lost all my friends. I basically don't see anyone anymore.
We had a movie night in your backyard where we watched a martial arts film.
That's true. Basically all I have is Justin. And I have Luke, too. Basically, just people that I host podcasts with.
Yeah, that's right. That's all you need, man.
That's all I have left, because I have professional obligations with these people.
Yes, otherwise you would probably be in a Charlie Kaufman-like existence where you speak to no one.
You know what I miss, Justin? I miss having acquaintances. Did you ever used to have acquaintances? I feel like I've lost all those thanks to the pandemic.
No, you know what? This is the funny thing. I was never someone who had acquaintances. I usually have friends that I talk with regularly, but other than that, not really.
It's fine. You don't need acquaintances. It's okay.
But I think it's just that you like going out and I don't like going out, which is the big difference.
You know what? That's it. We solved it. But anyway, we both went out together this week. We went to Sunnyside Beach in Toronto. It was advertised as Sunnyside Beach, but it was just a little bit to the east.
Yeah. In other words, me and Will wandered for an hour looking for it.
Went in the wrong direction. Ridiculous.
I did spot it, and it was a bunch of teenagers, and I went, uh-oh, this doesn't seem right. But no, that was right. That's where I should have been.
But we got there on time, fortunately, and we saw a screening of the 1989 Italian horror film Killer Crocodile. Who is this directed by? Not one of the big guys, right?
No, I don't know. I just know that the guy who worked on a lot of late period Lucio Fulci films did the big crocodile in the movie.
Okay, well, anyway, it's set in, I guess, New Orleans, and it's a Jaws ripoff, basically. It has that slightly distant Italian pretending to be an American film quality.
But the big difference between this movie and Jaws is that, like, Killer Crocodile goes, we paid for this giant crocodile, and we're going to show this crocodile at every possible moment, because from the get-go you see it, and anytime it shows up, you see it from multiple angles. This giant leaden thing that can barely move, and it's beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very impressive special effect for an Italian horror film from 1989, which means it's not quite as good as the shark from Jaws that they intentionally hid because it looked fake.
Yeah, I mean, I would take the giant crocodile over the shark from Jaws, which can't really do that much except go up, while this crocodile can kind of like skim the water a little bit. It opens and closes its mouth. At one point, there's a quick shot of a puppet crocodile in what looks like a little pool opening its mouth.
I heard you laughing really hard during that part.
Yeah.
Killer Crocodile, a lot of it's boring, but the parts of it that are good are really good. So I recommend it.
At this point in time where it feels like every Italian exploitation movie has been released like, I don't know, a dozen times, stuff like Killer Crocodile is finally coming to light. The late 80s stuff that is not as good as the best, but it still has its highs, I guess.
It has its highs, and like the late 80s stuff, you don't see the kind of poetry that you see in the best of Argento or Fulci, but you do see a shamelessness.
Yeah, that's right.
This movie has a scene where the Robert Shaw character basically rides... Joe, yeah. He rides on the back of a crocodile and is stabbing it, and then shortly after that, there's a scene where, like, what do? They throw the propeller blade into the crocodile.
The crocodile's mouth, which then explodes, splattering everybody with blood.
And this description doesn't do it justice.
Oh, no. When it happens, it's like the audience was on their feet at this screening, which was on the beach, so it was all outdoors, just cheering and hollering.
Oh, good stuff. Yeah, I definitely enjoyed it.
And, we say this as if it's like a lost film. No, Severin put it out a few months ago on Blu-ray, Killer Crocodile 1 and 2, so you can pick it up. Perfect remastered widescreen because everything is available now.
I think this may be the last one, actually. I think every other Italian horror movie has been found. Can you name one that hasn't?
It's like one that only exists in like a crappy version?
Yeah.
Not off the top of my head.
And God Said to Cain.
Yeah, that's right. Coming soon to Golden Ninja Video. Not remastered.